Welcome back to NRA News, Cam and Company, sponsored by Nosler. Join our friend Charles Cooke from National Review with us. Charles, how are you, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I'm loving the song Slow Ride, especially by Foghat.
By Foghat, absolutely. Woo! What a great tune. Always aim to please here. How you been, man?
I might do this more often. I could take you into my personal jukebox. I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. I appreciate you coming on the program. We were talking about your piece at National Review yesterday. Another brazen lie from Moms Demand Action. As you say, they've got this meme. It's about an incident that took place partially in Washington State, and you say that you don't think this is any accident. This is referring to and maybe trying to influence the vote in Washington State on I-594. But they have this case of a guy, Dmitry Smirnoff. They say that he navigated loopholes in our law, was able to acquire a gun from a private seller, was able to acquire ammunition, and then use that gun and ammunition to kill a woman that he had been stalking in Chicago, Illinois. And if we had background checks in Washington State, if I-594 had been law, that Mr. Smirnoff would not have been allowed, he would not have been able to do this. He would have been stopped somehow, Charles.
Right, and I knocked it on the, I think, eminently reasonable grounds that it's a lie. The case for background checks should be debated on its own terms, or we should perhaps stop calling them background checks, which is what they call them, and note that it is background checks on private sales. It is, of course, already federal law that guns bought in stores are subject to background checks. Washington State does not have background checks on private sales, and it may be about to get them if the initiative goes through on November 4th. But that question, interesting as it is, has absolutely nothing to do with the case of Dmitry Smirnoff, for the simple reason that Smirnoff was not allowed by law, by federal law and by state law, to buy, possess, or transfer a gun in any manner at all. He wasn't allowed to go into a store and buy a gun. He wasn't allowed to buy a gun on the street from a friend. He wasn't allowed to buy or transact a gun through a gun show. He wasn't even allowed to be given a gun by a friend because he was neither a citizen of the United States or a legal permanent resident such as myself, and therefore was ineligible. So the details of Washington State's transactional system are irrelevant, and Moms Demand Action is lying, not misleading, but lying by insinuating otherwise.
And I would agree with you. But again, they have to do this, Charles, because they're trying to make that, again, that very powerful emotional case. It's not data points they're relying on. They're relying on an anecdote here. And, you know, if they were to acknowledge that laws were broken, not that loopholes were navigated, but that laws were broken along the way, then what is to stop an additional law? I mean, the argument is that, well, if we have this one more law, Charles, then they'll follow that one. All of the other ones that they haven't followed up to now, that's because of other reasons. But if we have this one in place, they will follow this law.
Right. You get the impression that they think that the latest law that they want is not a tractor law, but is a force field. The reality is Dmitry Smirnoff knew that he was ineligible. He therefore bought a gun from a criminal on the street, paid him a little extra for having engaged in criminal activity, which is risky. It's a federal crime, and then paid a homeless man to buy him ammunition, which he was not allowed to buy either. In fact, we know that Smirnoff was up on all the laws that he intended to break because he investigated before he shot his ex-girlfriend whether the state in which he planned to kill her had the death penalty. That came out of the trial. This was a man who knew what he was doing. Now, I think that Moms Demand Action have once again, if you'll excuse the expression, shot themselves in the foot. And I say that for two reasons. Firstly, because they are peddling a meme that is demonstrably untrue and that will further damage their reputation. It is being pointed out, not just by me, but by others, that they're lying. But more importantly, and you hinted at this earlier, the laws already in place did nothing. Dmitry Smirnoff knew full well that he was not allowed to buy a gun, and so he bought one illegally. I have never heard a good case as to why his behavior would have been any different if another state law had been piled on top. It was already categorically illegal. It wouldn't have changed human behavior. It wouldn't have put an ankle bracelet on him or on the man who sold him the gun. There are already laws, not just those that prohibit non-citizens and non-permanent residents from buying guns, but prohibit other citizens from selling guns to those they know are ineligible, which we know was the case because he was paid extra to do it. Mum's Demand Action cannot make the case that an extra law would have done anything. It wouldn't.
Talking with Charles Cooke from National Review. Charles, you say again that in their excitement and their ignorance, Mom's Demand Action has ended up making the opposite case from one that it intended to make. And the process confirmed once more that the gun control movement's most formidable foe continues to be its own rank stupidity. I think part of the trouble, though, is that they don't actually expect or anticipate too many people to delve into these memes or to really fact check what they're saying. Part of the appeal is, in fact, I think that most people will accept what they see or say at face value.
Yes, that's right. They do. They also wildly overestimate the reflexive support for their positions.
Mm-hmm.
Americans are not as into gun control, I think, as Mum's Demand Action presumes. The case for background checks on private sales is a difficult one to make, but it really has one virtue, I think, and that is that it would remove some of the situations in which a law-abiding citizen transfers a firearm without knowing that he is doing so to a criminal. Federal law already holds that you cannot sell a gun to a person who is not allowed one or who wouldn't pass a background check. But we should admit, for the sake of intellectual honesty, occasionally a good man is going to sell a bad man a gun without knowing it. That's the case in a nutshell. The problem is that's a marginal case. It's not a very sexy case. And so what Mum's Demand Action has taken to doing is somehow pretending that criminals who know full well already that they can't pass a background check and therefore opt out of the law, as criminals by definition do, will somehow be stopped by a second law that mirrors the first law. This is silly. But it's their main chance at getting what they want because it sounds compelling. Because in that case, you can pretend that criminals will not be able to get their hands on guns rather than what you and I consider to be more likely, which is that criminals will continue to get their hands on guns at almost exactly the same rate. They will just do so breaking two laws and not one.
And to that end, I find it very interesting because, along with this belief apparently that, if we have this law, they won't break this law. They don't really want to get into the details of this specific case, nor is there apparently a great eagerness in Washington State to really get into the nitty-gritty of what I-594 would do, because it goes far beyond either of those situations that you just described, Charles. I mean, the exemptions for having to go through a background check, even for temporary transfers of firearms, they don't cover common things like if you were to go hang out at somebody's house to do some plinking, as you have done before, and that homeowner would say, "Hey, Charles, here, you want to shoot this?" That would be a crime unless you had a background check done first.
Yes, and this is the great fear with private sales being bound by laws written by fallible and in some cases nefarious human beings. There are minor upsides to ensuring that the law-abiding do not get duped. I will grant that. But as we've seen in Colorado, which has one of the worst and most loosely written background check laws of them all, this tends to hurt people who really cannot afford to be hurt. I'm referring to a case I wrote up, a woman named Sarah who works in a dangerous area. She's a cleaner. She was in a car accident, and at the hospital, the authorities took her gun overnight to put into storage so that it wasn't floating around the hospital. Now, I have absolutely no problem with that, but the next day when they went to give it back to her, the district attorney said, no, you can't. You can't give it back to her because by taking it into your custody, albeit temporarily, you have transferred it, and you will need to transfer it back. It took her 3 months to get the gun. We also saw during the flooding at the end of last year in Colorado the suggestion from authorities that neighbors could not hand their firearms over to friends and family with the rest of their possessions to avoid their being lost in the water. These are problems that are coming up over and over again, and they far outweigh any marginal benefits that applying another law to criminals is able to achieve. Now, when most people, I think, hear that case, they back off with enthusiasm. Moms Demand Action, of course, doesn't want you to hear that calculation. They want you to presume that the law contains an exception that permits non-citizens to come into the country, buy a gun, and murder their ex-girlfriend, when, of course, the law already prohibits all of the stages that led from A to B for Dmitry Smirnoff and everybody else.
Talking with Charles Cooke from National Review. Listen, Charles, I really appreciate you coming on the program, and anytime you want to listen to some music, just give us a call. We're always here for you.
Absolutely. I'm going to go and listen to both Foghat and Mountain now so I can distinguish between the two.
Appreciate it. Charles Cooke joined us here from National Review.